couple of days ago, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has beheaded 47 people. And amongst those 47 people was an important Shia imam. Following this event, the tension in the Middle East has risen up again, has increased, especially between countries of Shia majority and Sunni majority. We will talk about this topic with two Middle East experts. One of them is Mr. Jafari. He just set up the Amsterdam Initiative for Iranian Studies. He is the Iran expert in this conversation, and he is also an Iranian himself. Next to that, he also wrote the book Iran, van de revolutie tot vandaag. Next to him, we have Paul Aarts, who is a Middle East expert as well, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia. He actually also just got back from a journey to Saudi Arabia, a 2 weeks visit of Saudi Arabia, so he can tell us all about the situation in Saudi Arabia. He also is the author, the co-author of the book Saudi Arabia, een revolutie die nog moet komen. We will talk about this topic with those two experts, especially focusing on 4 questions. Who is contesting who in this conflict? Why are they contesting each other? How can we understand the recent developments within this conflict, and how can we place these recent developments in the conflict in the broader picture? And how do the dynamics of the Middle East influence the geopolitical dynamics? Having said that, hopefully you're looking forward as much to this conversation as I am. And you can also join the discussion by simply using the microphone in the middle. Nicole is holding up the microphone. Or what you also can do is you can Twitter with us by using #RFD. Ladies and gentlemen, enough for now. Give them a warm applause. Paul Aarts and Peyman Jafari.
Yeah.
Mr. Aarts, Mr. Jafari, welcome on my behalf as well. The first 15 minutes of this interview, we will explore the different key players in the region. But first, Mr. Aarts, you spent 2 weeks in Saudi Arabia. How is the current situation right now?
You mean in general or related to? Well, in general, that's a very difficult question to answer, of course. So let me relate to the topic of today. Sure. I think that's what they all came for, to hear more about. Before going, I knew a bit about how the Saudis, in general, so I'm generalizing now, that there was some fear, some apprehension vis-à-vis Iran. Being there for 2 weeks, talking to many people, many different kinds of people, middle class, high middle class, and even a princess, I found out, and I was deeply impressed in a negative way, about the deep obsession with Iran. It is the key driver, more than I thought before going there. It's the key driver of Saudi foreign policy. So that was a kind of shock for me.
And you were also there when the news came out with...
No, I was on my plane back home when it happened.
So, did you still have contact with the people you talked to during your visit?
Yes. I have a close colleague who works at King Saud University, Political Science Department, whom I know for many years now. And I had a long Skype conversation with him yesterday, more than 1 hour.
And what was his reaction?
He is in full agreement with the government policy. And he is a liberal. So mind you, he is a liberal. So from my visit, I draw the conclusion that this is the overall sentiment in Saudi Arabia, that Iran is the danger, and it should be stopped.
Okay, Mr. Jafari, you're Iranian yourself. How did you perceive the news?
Well, I'm first an academic. I mean, I don't receive the news as an Iranian or anywhere else. So it's good to have that clear. I mean, I'm worried about the escalating conflict because this has been going for a long time, since the Iranian Revolution, basically, the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this is another step in that escalation. And of course, there are also forces that want to de-escalate. I mean, we all know what happened, yes? So Al-Nimr was executed, the Saudi Arabia embassy was ransacked, and then Saudi Arabia broke ties with Iran, with a number of other Arab countries. But I think what was a good sign on the Iranian side was that President Rouhani and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs have made their apologies for the ransacking of the Saudi embassy, trying to de-escalate the situation. So I think that was one hopeful sign.
Now you just mentioned it already. It's not just this escalation, and this escalation is the conflict is going on for already many years. Now within this conflict, who is contesting who? Is it only Iran versus Saudi Arabia?
I mean, the main basic, when we are talking about the conflict, is these are two main countries of the region. I mean, next to Egypt, which is in number of population equal to Iran. But I mean, in terms of vying for hegemony within the region, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been, since the Iranian Revolution, two main competitors. But the question, of course, is why? And I think it is really a simplification, what we always see in the media and so on. This is a Shia-Sunni competition. That's always the simple answer that comes up.
Before we come to the question of why, we want to try to get an overview of the nature of the state and who is in charge in Iran, for example.
Well, I would say the situation in Iran is much more complex than the situation in Saudi Arabia. I would say Saudi Arabia in many ways is a very traditional autocratic monarchy. In Iran you have the supreme leader who has lots of power, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. But you do have a president which is elected. You do have a parliament in which different political factions are competing against each other and having different programs. So Rouhani is from what is called the pragmatists, like Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, being a very much conservative person. So there is a complex situation of different power centers in Iran.
It is a theocracy, right? Or
I don't fully agree with that term myself. I think because of that electoral situation you have in Iran as well, that it's not only the clerics who have all the power, there are politicians who are elected, there is a huge bureaucracy, and there is the military and so on. So it is much more complex than saying the clerics have all the power, so it is a theocracy.
When it comes to religion, what is the percentage of Shia and Sunni religion people?
Well, approximately 90% are Shia and 10% are other religions, most of them Sunnis, and the Sunnis are in the east of Iran towards Balochistan, Pakistan, but also among the Arab population in the southwest of Iran.
Just to make sure, what is the difference between Shia and Sunni? Could you explain that quickly?
Well, okay, very briefly. It goes back to the beginning of Islam as a religion. So who would be the follower of Prophet Muhammad? So the Shia thought Ali should be the follower, while the others the caliphs should follow him. And that itself has been actually political competition even at the very beginning. So the other theological differences that came up, like how people pray and other interpretations, and the Sunnah, you know, how the Prophet lived and so on, those were added actually gradually later on.
Okay, Mr. Aarts, the same question actually. Can we get an overview of who is in charge in Saudi Arabia?
Like Peyman said, I think to a large extent that's correct. The political system, how it works in Iran, is much more complex. There are way more figures who matter. In Saudi Arabia, there are just a few who matter. And I think paramount is the king. He has full powers. Maybe the king is comparable to the supreme leader in Iran in a way, because there are always many differences.
What is the main difference?
Well, the supreme leader is the political leader and the religious leader, while the king in Saudi Arabia is only the political leader, while he is in close alliance with the religious elite. But he's, well, and on paper he is also, his title is the custodian of the two holy places. So on paper he's also the religious leader, but it's different from Iran in that sense.
The two holy places are?
Mecca, Medina.
Mecca, Medina, which are important places for
the two most important places for Muslims all over the world, Sunni, Shia, whatever kind Islam you're speaking about. But then below the king, and the present king is in a very frail condition. Some people say he is suffering from dementia, or worse even. I don't think that's true, but anyhow. But below the king you have two important people, the crown prince and the deputy crown prince. And the most interesting figure is the deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is only 30 years old, so he's a very young guy, which is very surprising in the Saudi context, because normally speaking it's 70, 80 years old men who rule the country. And he is now seen as the strong man in the regime. He's also the architect of the war in Yemen, for instance.
Is it really he's more of fighting a confrontation compared to, there has been a change in the within the royal house, right?
Yes, yes. The succession has now been done to this, what is called the second generation. So the young people now are coming to the fore, in particular this Mohammed bin Salman. Yeah.
And is he more confronting the, or you said he's the architect of the Yemen war?
The Yemen war, but more important, but not so interesting for this meeting, I think, is that he is trying to transform the Saudi economy from an oil-based to a more diversified economy. And he's very energetic on that, in trying to do this.
How is he influencing the politics in Middle East? Or how is he
Mohammed bin Salman, you mean?
Yes.
Well, he's Minister of Defense too. And well, then I have to refer again to the war in Yemen. And the war in Yemen is fully framed in the context of the struggle with Iran. So what most Saudis, as I said in my earlier answer, what most Saudis see is that Iran is expanding its influence at the cost of Saudi Arabia. And then we should have a map now, but there is not, so I can show you the map by using my hand. So this is Saudi Arabia. Then you have Yemen, which is being controlled increasingly by Iran, the Saudis say, because they are supporting the Houthis, which is not true actually, but no, that is their perception. Then in Bahrain, there's Iran. Then Iraq has been overtaken by Iran completely. That is the way they see it in Saudi Arabia. Then we have the link between Iran and Syria, Bashar al-Assad, which is true. You have the link between Iran and Hezbollah, which is true. So if you look at the map, they say we are being encircled by Iran, and this has to stop. And Mohammed bin Salman is one of those guys who's very aggressively developing a policy to do that.
And was he also the one who took the decision that those 47 people should die on that very day?
No, no, no. That decision is being taken by the Minister of Interior, the one I referred to earlier, Mohammed bin Nayef, who is his nephew. And he is a very tough guy. He is called the Prince of Counter-Terrorism because he defeated Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia between 2003 and 2007. And so he has a very high-standing authority when it comes to combating terrorism. And he was the one who said these 47 people should be executed now.
Yeah, so we're talking already about the why question with the beautiful map, but Iran has exactly the same, right? Because they also felt isolated. Yeah. And drawing on that, do you think, the why question, why the isolation of Iran, do you think that's one of the main reasons, or are there other reasons?
Well, okay, let's start with that and then go back a bit, because the same could be coming from the Iranian side, like, look, we have been encircled by both Saudi Arabia and its allies, and by the way, by the United States. I mean, if you look to the Persian Gulf, the US has military bases in Bahrain, also in Saudi Arabia, and...
No, not in Saudi Arabia.
Not anymore?
No.
Not anymore, okay. But they were there in the 90s?
Yes, there were.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, well, in Bahrain. And also that...
And Qatar and the Emirates.
And the Emirates. Yeah. So the issue is that Saudi Arabia has been actually supporting all the Arab countries, and the only country with which Iran has a linked country is Syria. Assad. I mean, Hezbollah is a faction in Lebanon. So they would say, look, we, as the only friend that we had is Syria. And why is it also a friend? Because during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which was really traumatic, both for Iranians and for Iraqis, you know, hundreds of thousands of deaths, Saudi Arabia was supporting Saddam Hussein and also all the other countries except Syria. So that goes a bit back, but we can also go a little further, because when we go to the 1960s and 1970s, we see that actually Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah were partners. They were called the two pillars of American power in the region. They were collaborating, more or less. They were also vying for competition, but it was like who has more. They were, in general, friends. Then the Iranian Revolution came, which was, of course, opposed against the Iranian American interference in Iran. So from that point, they became competitors. But I would say not because they were Shia and Sunni, but what has been the case for Saudi Arabia, I think, is really the political system that Iran represented at that moment, like the kind of political Islam that gives a bit more participation to the population, like through elections, and the revolution itself was really a kind of popular uprising.
So now you're talking about the political power play which is happening in the Middle East.
Can I react? Because a bit of debate is always nice also for the audience.
I agree.
Right.
Because normally we are in full agreement, Peyman and I. We are not so interesting for an audience, but now we have some disagreements.
Great.
So here we go.
Bring it on.
Here we go.
There we go.
When I was showing the map and the so-called Iranian encirclement, the same map was there in 2003, 2004. Then Iran really was encircled by American military forces in Iraq. You know, how many hundred thousands were there?
And Afghanistan.
And Afghanistan. So then the map was very clear. Iran was being encircled. But things have changed. And this is what Peyman forgets now a bit.
No,
because in Iraq, no, you didn't mention Iraq. You mentioned Syria, Bashar al-Assad, full ally, Hezbollah, full ally. But Iraq, I don't want to say that the regime in Baghdad is a proxy of Tehran. That would be wrong. But on the ground in Iraq, there are really strong influences, commercially, ideologically, so a little bit less, and via the Shia militia, which are really in the hands of Tehran, the Revolutionary Guards, and others. So if the Saudis say to me, look at the map, and they point at Iraq, I think they have a point.
Yep. But I have to disappoint you, Paul, because I agree with this. I mean, it's, I was going to, because this situation changed after 2003, but I think, I don't know what you think about it. I mean, from the Saudi perception, maybe it was a plan. I would say the fact that Iran has increasing power in Iraq, you know, because, you know, the Shia were repressed under Saddam Hussein, so they are lying, but it is also much more complex. Like Sistani is not somebody who really prefers the Iranian political system, so in Iraq it's really much more complex. It's not a toy of Iran. I mean, they have their own autonomy, but they're friends, absolutely, and Iran has lots of influence. But the fact that Iran gained more increasing power in Iraq was because of the disaster of the Iraqi war. I mean, getting away of Saddam Hussein and basically power vacuum which came out of it, and that Iran could, you know, extend its power, and especially when ISIS rose up, and so Iran could say, now we are the ones fighting ISIS, and so on.
Yes, let me try to structure this again a bit, because we're at the why question, and for example, the media portray it as a Sunni-Shia conflict, and maybe to start that, do you agree? Because you talk a lot about power, so is it a power or a religion conflict?
For me, it's really about power, and religion comes in there in a secondary place, in my point of view. I mean, it plays a role, but always as an afterthought, and it is being abused both by Iran and by Saudi Arabia. I mean, to be clear, for instance, Sunnis are being discriminated in Iran as well. I don't think there is the same rhetoric. The Iranian clerics don't use the same rhetoric that we hear from Saudi Arabia, like Sunnis are basically no Muslims, because I think in Wahhabism in general, there is really a kind of an anti-Shia tendency. I don't see that coming from Iran, but there is discrimination of Sunnis. So let's be clear on that as well.
Mr. Aarts, would you agree that the power conflict is communicated through the religion differences within those countries?
Yes, increasingly so. And you know, the genie is out of the bottle, so it will be very difficult to put it back into the bottle. But from the very beginning, as Peyman already explained, you know, these two countries had rather good relations in the 70s, the twin pillar approach, during the Cold War. Of course, the 79 Islamic Revolution changed that. So in the 80s, there were problems between the two. We should not forget that the first time that they broke diplomatic relations was in 1987-88 because of an incident that happened in Mecca. Mm-hmm. But it was restored, I think, in 1 year or 2 years later.
2 years
okay,
later. Yeah.
2 years later. And then they had, you know, it was ebb and flow. Even under this strange guy, Ahmadinejad, who was president of Iran for 8 years, there were not so bad relationships between the two.
Is it escalating now?
It's sure, it's escalating. And also, as Peyman said, you know, the sectarian argument comes in and is being used as an instrument, but in the core, it's geopolitical rivalry. Full stop.
Yeah. And I can come back a bit on the Iranian side as well, but on the Saudi side, it is good to remind ourselves that Saudi Arabia was also opposing, for instance, Arab nationalism. So those are both Arabs and Sunnis, but they were really vehemently against Nasser in Egypt, for instance, because, you know, he was vying geopolitically, but also as a model for the Arab world. So they were against that, but they were also against Muslim Brotherhood, which is against the Sunni, you know, political organization, also religiously. So it's not really about Shia-Sunni, it is about the political model. And I think when we come a bit closer, what has changed is definitely 2003, Iran gaining more power, so Saudi Arabia being more worried about the extension of Iran, but also the nuclear deal, because of which Iran is normalizing its relations with the US and Europe, as Saudi Arabia has always had a privileged relationship with the US in particular.
Let me add, because I think this might be important on whether it is Sunni, Shia, or it is something else.
There must be more dimensions, right?
No, but what I would like to say is that also after the executions took place on the 2nd of January, but before that it was already happening, in the different places where conflicts are being fought out now, like in Yemen, like in Syria, in Iraq, Lebanon included,
proxy wars.
The so-called proxy wars. And there, the sectarian element has crept in enormously. And, you know, it started somewhere, and it went out of hand, so to speak. So sectarianism now is really determining the Syrian civil war. That's difficult to deny. But at the origin, the conflict between these two big hegemonic powers is not a sectarian conflict.
So now we have talked about who is contesting who and why are they contesting each other. Let me turn to the audience quickly. Do we have any questions right now? Just raise up your hands. Yes, we have a question over there.
What is the influence of the change of succession in Saudi Arabia last year when King Abdullah died and King Salman was in power now?
Mm-hmm. I think I already touched on that very briefly, but maybe 2 more sentences. Sure. There's a real change. King Abdullah was, well, old, but the same goes for King Salman, or Abdullah was much older. But he was normally being seen as a reformist, quietist in his foreign policy, always trying to mediate between conflicting powers and all that. For instance, he tried to mediate between Hamas and Fatah, which failed in the end, but he put a lot of energy in that. So it was a different kind of politician. Then King Salman came to power. And then we had the nuclear deal, which we already touched upon. And that was, of course, a big shock for the Saudis, because they feel left behind. That is what they literally say. The Americans were our best allies. Now the Americans have a rapprochement with Iran. where are we now? So that was a big shock for this king. And then he appointed his young son, Mohammed bin Salman, who is known to be, as some people would say, reckless, over-ambitious. And here again we come to the Yemen war, which is really a disaster.
Can I add something
Sure,
to that?
go ahead.
Because especially in monarchies, the moment of succession is very, a tense moment, because there are lots of risks, especially when that coincides with internal changes. And that brings me again to the Yemen war, because you have to take into account that Saudi Arabia is expending, I think, $200 million a day on the Yemen war. And it's...
Then the Saudis always say, but that includes salaries. So it's not that much.
Well, okay, but the fact is that they are making huge cutbacks because they had a deficit of $100 million last year. So they have to cut back, decrease the oil subsidies that they have in Saudi Arabia and so on. So that could also create tension among the population. So I think this is in general for Saudi Arabia where they feel a bit more insecure. I don't want to exaggerate that point, but I think the internal changes matter as well.
So just to make sure that I understand it properly, what you're saying is that the change in the royal house affected also the change of their political agenda as such that they changed from a more diplomatic way of handling the Middle East conflict to a more confronting way of handling the Middle East conflict.
Yep.
Okay. Now, of course, we've touched upon it already in the beginning. We will turn to the current developments, which occurred on the 2nd of January. Aarts, could you maybe just briefly explain what happened exactly on that day?
Whoa. I was in the airplane, but when I came home, telephone rang and media wanted to know what I think of this. Well, in the beginning I was a bit confused because it came very unexpected to me. When I was in Jeddah for some time, I received a phone call from a close Shiite friend, who's a very prominent guy. I cannot mention his name here. And he was informed a few days before that, before I talked to him, by a high-ranking Saudi official that the executions would not take place in the near future, maybe not at all. So that was a good sign. So coming home, the phone rang, executions took place. So that, for me, it was a big surprise. So then you start
What could be the reason?
Well, so then you start thinking, because you have to give an answer to these harassing journalists. And the most obvious answer I came with, which is different from what you mostly hear, also what you heard from Peyman 2 minutes ago, so here we have some small disagreement, is that it was mainly meant, but I'm not sure about it, because you have to speculate, so it's all speculation, to provoke Iran. Because the war in Yemen is not going that well, and Iran is still very much on the map. So, and this was an easy way to provoke Iran. You kill or you execute 43 Sunni terrorists, or people who are suspected to be terrorists, because the trial is not very fair in Saudi Arabia, and 4 Shiites, among whom Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who is not that prominent, by the way. He is very much being overstated, I think. Anyhow, so, and then Iran make a huge mistake. And here we may have another disagreement.
Yeah, Mr. Jafari.
No, let me explain this.
Finish,
yes,
and then
because I think, but again, this is speculation, this execution, and including Nimr al-Nimr, the Shiite sheikh, was set up as a trap. And Iran fell in the trap, which is very disappointing to me, because I know Iran very well. I met many diplomats in the past, and they are very clever. So why did they allow the Saudi embassy to be ransacked and put on fire? And in Mashhad, they did more or less, they tried to do the same. Why did Iran, some people in Iran at least, speak so openly about Shiites in Saudi Arabia? This confirms, in the Saudis' perspective, that Iran is meddling in internal affairs of neighboring countries, taking care of their Shiites. So this was exactly what the Saudis wanted, and Iran did it.
Mr. Jafari, do you agree with the disappointment of the Iranian reaction on this event?
Well, of course, I mean, the Saudis, I mean, we can speculate whether they had planned this as a plan for the Iranians to, as a trap or not, or to provocate. I think in general, the Saudis are playing panic football. I mean, they are kind of trying to give signs to their own population that if there is opposition, we will be ruthless about it. And the signal to Iran comes, I think, secondary. But in any case...
Yeah, exactly.
Vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
In any case, Iran, I think, fell into the trap. But you have to take, you know, there are different factions in Iran. So I think this was not set up by the government to ransack the Saudi Arabian embassy. There are hardline groups, the Basijis, you know, and so on, that went doing this. And I think to the embarrassment of the government, but even to the embarrassment of conservatives in Iran, because a number of clerics immediately, in the days after, they organized official demonstrations which were then peaceful, and they really, in very harsh terms, attacked those people who had ransacked the embassy.
You're arguing exactly contrary, so... I'm curious about the arguments, why it's panic football from the Iranian
You think
side?
the Iranians, the Iranian government planned
they found the threat,
I think the government, you know, that is all speculation. I think the government could have done more to hinder, because you know that these crazy guys, instigated by Basiji or rogue elements from the Revolutionary Guard, go to the embassy and try to attack the embassy.
Yeah,
so they didn't do that. Why? I don't know.
Because we have elections in February in Iran. The point is that the factional politics in Iran is running high. So, I mean, it was very, very funny because the police commander in Tehran said, "What do you expect of us, to beat up the people when they ransack the embassy?" When I thought, well, you were beating them up in 2009 without any problems.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I mean, the point is that those rogue figures are influential. I mean, and the police and so on are scared of them because parts of them are aligned to the secret services and so on. So I think this was a disaster because, and many Iranian politicians actually acknowledged it, like, look, we were winning because Saudi Arabia actually showed what they are doing in the region, and then we fell in the trap. So I mean, I don't think it was one reaction from the Iranian side. I think the factional politics again was playing a huge role here.
Let's take a step back, because now we're already arguing why they reacted how. But how did Iran react? What happened exactly in Iran following the news of the 47
Following the
executions?
news, immediately there were two demonstrations, one in Tehran, one in Mashhad. The embassy is in Tehran, the consulate of Saudi Arabia is in Mashhad. In both places, and especially in Tehran, a mob of, I don't know, 40, 50 people, I don't have the exact figures, attacked the Saudi embassy, went inside, torched it, and came out. Okay, and this was all filmed and so on. And there was, under the, of course, lots of condemnations from the Iranian side of, you know, the execution of Al-Nimr and so on. So they were condemning it, and this mob attacked the Saudi Arabian. But immediately, I think the day after, first it was Rouhani and Zarif who said, apologies for this, and we will follow the perpetrators, and, you know, they will see justice. And even in the following day, so a number of conservative clerics repeated this. So I think there was some level of embarrassment on the Iranian side. But don't underestimate also the rock figures who absolutely did this and were happy of doing this, because they actually want to show that, you know, they are more influential than Rouhani. So that plays a part as well.
What you forget, if I may? Yeah,
yes, of course.
What you should not underestimate, that I'm going to use very rough language now. The Saudis don't give a shit about factional politics in Iran. They look what happened. You know, rogue elements, Revolutionary Guard, supreme leader, reformist, pragmatist. It's not important for them. They look at the country, what the country is doing to them. So this perception, you should really take it into consideration. You can.
I agree, but I mean, in diplomatic world, I mean, look what happened between Iran and U.S. just a few days ago with the American soldiers, going into Iranian waters. They were captured and they were hurt, and they were sent back. And Rouhani and Zarif are making this a big issue. Like, look, this is how diplomacy can work out as well. In the case of Iran and Saudi Arabia, I mean, you could, if with goodwill on the Saudi side, but you're right, there is no goodwill there, I think, they could have seen, look, the president is apologizing for what happened. You could have taken this for, okay, the Iranian side is tracking back and apologizing for this. But the tension is already too big to go there. I mean, the conflict has built up. But then again, we go to the causes of why I think the Saudis cannot think rationally anymore about this.
Whoa.
So, closing the embassy.
Wow.
Whoa.
Closing the embassy in...
We will have a talk after this meeting, and then I will beat them up.
Let's do it now. Let's do it now.
Pardon, can you repeat?
Let's do it now. Let's have the talk now.
Well, you should never say that a politician is not acting rational in a rational way. This was said. This was said of Gaddafi, and that was always nonsense. Gaddafi was a very calculating politician. He made some stupid mistakes, but everybody makes stupid mistakes every now and then. So I think Mohammed bin Salman and his father, the king, is very rational. Panic football, I not fully agree on that. They are really in a situation of feeling surrounded, and the Yemen war is not, it's not panic football. What happened in Yemen? Are we going to talk about Yemen later, or shall we do it now?
We can, if you want to.
Okay, because I try to understand. I was in Yemen many times with students in an exchange program, so I know the Yemenis a little bit. I also know who the Houthis are, and there is a lot of talk in Saudi Arabia that the Houthis are being supported by Iran, that a proxy of Iran, it's being said. So many Saudis believe that, and I'm.
So you think that's rational?
Well, if you talk to them, and I advise you to sit with them, they come with a list of, arms, shipments, flights, and all that. But I think it's overstated. There is, of course, a relationship. But the point I would like to make is that the Houthis made a huge mistake. Maybe they were irrational in that sense. When they came from the north, that is their territory, and they are very much discriminated against, so they had something at stake, so to say. But then they went to the south. They captured Sana'a, and they went even to Aden in the south. Well, when they captured Aden, then the Saudis said, this is a red line. Whether it is Houthis or Shiites or whatever, we cannot tolerate an anti-Saudi regime in Sana'a. I think this is very rational from the Saudi point of view.
Mr. Jafari, one reaction, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Just like individuals, politicians, when they are acting under fear, I think they do very stupid things. And I think the Saudi house is really acting from fear. I mean, as you say, I mean, whether it is real or not, the perception of fear. And of course also the revolutions of 2011, and that has really nothing to do with Iran, is very important here. I mean, the Saudis saw two of their big allies, the dictator in Egypt and in Tunisia, chased away by the people. And they really wanted to stop this movement, threatening their own positions and their allies. So when in Bahrain there was a demonstration, they thought again supported by Iran, and we know this is not the case. Again, they sent their tanks to kind of crush the Bahraini revolt. So I think more than the Iranian threat per se, the Saudi house is really fearful of people.
So the narrative is now the losing of power, and that's why they're...
in the region, they look around them and they see, well, the geopolitical situation is shifting. There are all democratization movements that have been beaten back in 2011. But, there are so many stuff changing while we have this Saudi kingship, which is very conservative and doesn't like change at all.
Would you agree that the Saudi government, or regime is a better term, the Saudi regime is afraid of its people. That the same applies to Iran?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
in one aspect, both Saudi Arabia and Iran are very good in externalizing their internal problems. I mean, Iran has been doing this as well. I mean, again, the perception of threat in 2005, after 2003, basically, when US invaded Iraq. They also used those, you know, the threat of the US in restricting internal opposition. Iran can do this very well as well.
Yep. Okay, let's turn to the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please raise your hands. I see some in the...
In the back and in the front.
Yeah?
Yeah, well, the answer can be very short. It's idiotic to have a country like Saudi Arabia as a chair of the Human Rights Council. The same would apply to Iran. You know, don't forget that Iran executes 4 times as much people on a yearly basis than Saudi Arabia. 4 times as much.
Because Saudi Arabia is the chair, Iran is not.
Yeah.
Can you repeat it in the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, that should not have happened. But
yeah.
I don't know if we are going to talk about this later, but I wanted to bring in the double standards actually as well, because I agree. I mean, Iran is 3rd place in number of executions, I believe.
Per capita,
they are
number 1.
Per capita, they are 3. I think China is... No, sorry, not
per
China.
Capita.
Yeah.
Per capita, it's number 1.
Sorry,
anyway, both are human rights violators. I mean, let's be clear about that. Saudi Arabia, Iran. There are also, of course, differences. I mean, you have to see that the majority of the cases in Iran are about drug trafficking, because Iran is next to Pakistan and Afghanistan. But nevertheless, I mean, there are not fair trials, and executions are inhuman. So both are human rights violators. But the problem I really have is with the different conduct that the EU and the US have with both countries. Because while Iran is a human rights violators, we saw it also in 2009. You know, there were demonstrations and the Iranian police attacked the demonstrators. So everybody was condemning it, and there was lots of stuff going on. And with Saudi Arabia, until very recently, I must say, much more was tolerated from Saudi Arabia. I mean, I always come with this example as well. When King Abdullah died, the Dutch Majesty went there visiting in, politicians agreed with this. I don't see that happening when Khamenei will die, that we will send, you know, high-level
we will actually
for
start to talk about the different standards, as you mentioned it later on, but before we turn to like how we, as the West, should react or condemning those events, do we still have any questions concerning the recent developments? Recent developments, I see a lady in the back.
So first of all, I have a question for you that you said that
for who is who?
Paul, I think.
Paul, Mr. Aarts.
Mr. Aarts.
Sure.
Okay.
So in Saudi Arabia, like the difference between Iran government and Saudi Arabian government is that the Iranian government holds that they governing the religion and the state, but Saudi Arabia is only for the state. And I think it's not true, because when Mohammed al-Wahhabi came to the family of Saudi, they made an agreement, and according to that, like Saudi state based on the Saudi nationalism is based on the religion and loyalty for the family. So, for example, today that we understand from nationalism is that the dignity for the citizenship and the law for the democracy and stuff. So, on the other hand, that you're talking about like a democracy that you claim that, I'm not sure which one of you that claim that Saudi Arabia has performing a kind of democracy, but I don't believe it, because there is not even a law for women to vote in the elections.
Could you quickly rephrase it in one short question?
So, how can you say that for Saudi Arabia? This is only valid that their government is for the state. I can't believe it, because the religion is so important for them.
Yeah, but I think I tried, but I will clarify. I think in Iran it's more a full merger full merger between religion and politics. And of course, there are many other factions, as Peyman also already has said. In Saudi Arabia, it's more of an institutional separation between the clergy and the House of Saud. Although the king is the custodian of the two holy places, but still there are two spheres, while I think the spheres in Iran are more intermingled. But you know, it's all relative. It's not an absolute distinction. And I didn't make the claim that Saudi Arabia is democratic.
It's even more autocratic. No, I said it's even more autocratic than Iran. It's more autocratic than Iran because in Iran at least you have these different centers of power, and even on Iranian TV you can watch the parliament and people really having heated debates, which you wouldn't immediately see in Saudi Arabia. And even in reports that quantify this, you can see it like the Freedom House reports and Polity4 and so on. If you go and see the figures on the level of autocracy, you will see that I think in Freedom House, Saudi Arabia has 6 or 7, which is, you know, the most
autocratic.
So I don't know.
Great.
There's one more, but shall we
we're quickly going to continue with one more topic and then we come back to you, okay? Promise. Because we're going to talk about the two different standards you were mentioning. First of all, let us start from the beginning. How did the West react on the event occurred on the 2nd of January?
Well, they reacted by trying to de-escalate it because it's in nobody's interest if, above all the mess that is going on in the Middle East, there would be another one, which could lead into a war or at least more conflicts. So I think Magrini and Kerry were really calling with both the Iranian side and the Saudi side to try to calm down. So briefly, that's my impression of what the EU and the US were trying to do.
So Mr. Aarts, do you share this impression?
Yes, I think there was clear awareness in Washington and elsewhere, in Brussels, Moscow, that things have to calm down. Also because, and here I was wrong in my first reaction which I gave in the media, I said now this reconvening of the Syria conference later this month in Geneva, I think, will not take place at all. That was my first reaction. And this proves that you never should give first reactions in the media because you... so this meeting is going to take place anyhow, and both countries will be present. So that's hopeful.
So if we want to understand the recent events in the bigger picture, where can we expect the most, who is going to influence the situation from outside the most? Could it be Russia, the US, or is there any role from outside? Mr. Jafari?
I think the Middle East has been a very special place for outside forces. I mean, geopolitically it's very important because of the oil, but all kind of reasons. So everybody has a stake in it. The US traditionally has, of course, been, after the Second World War, very present in the Middle East. As I said, special ties, especially with Saudi Arabia.
But they have to choose now, right?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, some people are saying, like, the US is dropping Saudi Arabia. I don't believe they are dropping Saudi Arabia, but they are, I sense that they have cut back on their special relationship, especially because things are going better with Iran. But still, Iran is an adversary. I mean, you see that in the relationship. So I don't think we should make too much of that. And the Russians, of course, are trying to gain momentum in these kind of situations. So they said, we want to intermediate between the Saudis and the Iranians. Sorry?
Can we consider them because they're working together, Russia and Iran?
Yes, they're, I mean, yes, in general, they are allies, yeah.
Okay, and the US, the role of the US, is that diminishing or increasing after the nuclear deal?
Well, we go into the bigger picture. Yeah. The thing is, when Obama became president, I think he tried to, you know, his promise was, I will get the US out of Iraq, because that was also demand of the American people. So they had this bad experience of the wars. So fewer interventions in the Middle East. But I don't think he has been successful in getting the US out of the Middle East, especially because dealing with the heritage of US policy in the previous years. So the fallout from the Iraq war, I think, has destabilized Syria, has not caused as one-on-one, but has, really increased the rise of ISIS and so on. So I think there is a difficulty for the US not to interfere.
Now, if we zoom in again on a picture of Iran facing Saudi Arabia, is the international community treating those two countries differently according to the actions they take?
Absolutely, yes, I think so. But one shouldn't be surprised about that. When I was still teaching, I'm not teaching anymore, but when I was teaching, I always told students that in international diplomacy, and that applies to the Netherlands in particular when it comes to Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia, there is one standard, and that is double standards. That's it.
Why?
Each country develops its policies in terms of its own, what is called national interests, which is sometimes based on emotions, sometimes based on material interest or geopolitical interest, what have you.
When it comes to
so the double standard, it's very common. But of course, we should point out that that should not be the case. But don't be surprised that this happens.
What is the national interest of the Netherlands in this conflict? Why are we treating those differently?
Well, because we have a complicated, to put it mildly, relationship with Iran, because we are a close follower, as everybody should know, of Washington. Our foreign ministry, when they are confronted with taking a decision when it comes to international sensitive matters, they always look first at Washington. And London, for that matter, but London also looks at Washington. Yeah. So we are following U.S. foreign policy.
Mr. Jafari, do you agree with
most times? Most times.
I agree with that because this is the transatlantic link of the Dutch foreign policy, and you can look back to major events and moments. I mean, if you look to the Iraq War, there were European countries that were very critical of the U.S. position. US and Britain, of course, went into war, and the Netherlands was supporting it. And we had the politicians from the VVD, the politicians from CDA, mainly driving that car. But also when it comes to voting on Israel, for instance, it's the US always opposing resolutions on Israel in the Human Rights Council and so on, and Netherlands abstaining or so on. And it's becoming a little better, but again, the same case with Saudi Arabia. And I have been debating a number of parliamentarians lately again on this, especially because the Dutch government has explicitly said that human rights is the cornerstone of Dutch foreign policy. Then I question that. I mean, if it is the case, then you should be behaving as. I mean, again, I'm not surprised because we know that in these, but again, they always refer to national interests. But I think we have to question that as well. Whose national interests? Yeah. Is it in our interests that there is autocracy in Iran or in Saudi Arabia? So again, I think what is really important here, it is about democracy, I think. Unlike what we have pretending in the West, we have never been interested in democratization in the Middle East.
I'm sure.
Can I add one element, because this is maybe a good example of national interest. I was just came up. What is being said in The Hague and in London and in Paris and the other capitals of Western countries is that we need Saudi Arabia. We cannot condemn them that harshly as we condemn Tehran or others who violate human rights. For several reasons, but one reason stands at number one, and that is that Saudi Arabia is a very reliable partner in the war on terror. You hear that constantly. I heard it saying by Bert Koenders, our foreign minister. I heard it saying, it was said 10 days ago by a British minister, I think, that several attacks by IS or IS-like terrorist groups have not taken place on British soil, this gentleman said, because we have such a good link with Saudi intelligence. So we cannot condemn the Saudis that harshly for what they did on the 2nd of January.
So this message is clear. Time is running away, but we still have some questions, I believe. And we're starting with the lady in front.
My question is for both gentlemen. One thing I'm really missing in this discussion, which is very interesting, is actually the current state and the future of the Shia community in Saudi Arabia. Sheikh we can actually got executed because of his public opinion about human rights in Saudi Arabia, and he became the face of the Shia uprising in Saudi Arabia. So, for both gentlemen, what do you think? What is the future of the Shia population in Saudi Arabia? What's the future of the Shia uprising in Saudi Arabia, and what's the current state of the Shia leadership in Saudi Arabia?
We're going to start it with Aarts.
Okay, I shall try to be brief because this needs a very long answer. The leadership of the Shiites in the eastern province, for your information, Shiites in Saudi Arabia is 10 to 15% of Saudi citizens, which are 20 million, apart from the foreigners, which are 10 million. These are very divided. The leadership is very divided. You have the young and you have the old. I simplify now. And the leader of the young was Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. And the older generation, which are being called by the younger generation the notables, that is their nickname, the notables are always ready to negotiate with the government. And they go to the king, and they talk to the king, and they talk to the governor of the eastern province and all that. But then the young people say, let's stop talking, because they don't deliver. So let's go to the street, let's call for action, and then they used boards saying that down with the House of Saud and all that, which is quite radical in the Saudi context. So it's divided, which is problematic, I think, anyhow. The perspective is very bleak, very bleak. It was not very good. They are really standing on their own. They are not capable, not because of they make the mistake, but they are not capable of building an alliance with the other oppositionists of the Saudi regime in Sunni circles, because there are liberals, there are Islamists who are fighting against the regime, fighting with words, I mean. And so the opposition in Saudi Arabia is very divided, and that makes the regime stronger. That is my basic argument. The regime is so strong because the opposition is divided, and the Shiites cannot build a working relationship with the others. So they are standing on their own, which means that they will face a very dark future, at least in the coming years. That's Jafari, my estimate. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question. Mr. Jafari, if you allow me to, I would like to take one other question. Is there still one question which needs to be answered? Only one, and I see it goes to the gentleman in the light blue shirt.
No.
I'm interested in the double standards from the Dutch government towards this country, or actually the pragmatism or opportunism in general of the government, because what they choose for diplomacy with these countries also affects us here in Holland, including academic freedom. Because I remember when Shell wanted better ties with Iran because of the oil, Iran demanded from the Dutch government to be called a safe country, so that Iranian refugees would be sent back, would be declared a safe country.
Please keep your question short.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I will. And we protested here in Holland to declare Iran an unsafe country, so the refugees could stay here. But there was this rhetoric about refugees, just want to parasite, all the known racist rhetoric. But we won, and the refugees were not sent back anymore to Iran because of protesting in Holland. And so the ties with countries also affects the policy here, and the same with Rotterdam, the harbor, which deals with a lot of oil of Iran. That's all fine, but when there's Tariq Ramadan at the other university teaching, and then on Iranian television, then he's chasing...
Can you move towards the question to Mr. Jafari?
What could we do to defend our activities here, or what can we do to... these policies affect us, so how can we...
So the question is, what can we do against the double standards?
Yeah. I will actually try to tie in the two questions that you were posing as well, and because I agree with the picture that Paul was giving about the the grim situation at the moment, and that the sectarianism is a real issue now. I mean, whatever we think of it, it's a real issue now. But I think we really have a challenge to overcome this, and we all have responsibilities in this, both the people in the Middle East and we here in the Netherlands as well, of transcending this Shia-Sunni sectarianism, but also the West-East, the West-Middle East kind of obstacles, and really seeing this as a citizens' movement globally. Do we want a world that is safer? Do we want a world in which there is more democracy, in which there is more social justice, or not? And if we want that, we should be taking steps towards it. So in the Middle East, I think it is really important to demand equal citizen rights for Sunnis and Shias, that would be part of the movements that are in the Middle East. By the way, both, for instance, in Israel, equal citizen rights for Israelis and Palestinians. And that is very important because in 2011, in Egypt, I think there was really this hope. People could see it, people are on the street demanding democratization. By the way, Saudi Arabia has done a lot to counter that revolution in Egypt. And I think one of the factors contributing to the defeat of the revolution in Egypt is the counter-revolution that Saudi Arabia, with the military and so on, envisaged. So I think it is very important to support those kind of movements that transcend these sectarian divisions. And in this we have a role as well to kind of counter our own politicians, or at least question their policies of what you are doing. Is this in support of democracy in the Middle East in the long term, or is it countering it?
All right, I think that's a nice last note for the future. Unfortunately, we're run out of time. The two things I want to say: next week we got a new session in Dutch. Sorry for that, for the English people, but it's about geldcreatie with Zweden van Wijnbergen and Martijn Jeroen van der Linden. Next to that, tonight, due midnight, the applications are open, so if you want to interview here as well, feel free to apply. And from now, I want to thank our guests, Mr. Paul Aarts and Mr. Peyman Jafari.